Hello friends and welcome to the 2025 Swarthmore Lecture. I'm Mandy Cooper, I'm the CEO of Woodbrook, and we are an international Quaker learning and research organisation based in the UK, and we've been delivering the Swarthmore Lectures since 1908. Last year I talked about the Swarthmore Lectures as an extraordinary body of work, accessible to all, and with the ability to transcend time and place, to share the message and mission of the Society of Friends over the last century and into the future. This year, I'd like to briefly shine a light onto what goes into creating this work and extend an invitation to anyone that may feel led to join the committee. The Swarthmore Lecture Committee is Woodbrook's single longest running group. First established the concept of the lecture on December the 9th, 1907. Over the preceding years, the people fulfilling service on that committee have, of course, changed many times. But the mission has remained the same. It is a testament to the importance of the work and the committee's determination to uphold its original vision that I believe has taken it beyond its centennial and into this new millennium, while continuing to express a voice for the spirit of the age. It is our hope to involve more people within our committee, bringing diverse views and insight and experience to the discernment of the work, to continue to illuminate the way ahead, to ask the questions: what do we need to hear? When do we need to hear it? And who can speak to this? There is no qualification required. The lecturer is discerned in the Spirit. The lecturer discerns their lecture in the Spirit. And the committee welcomes its new members by discernment in the Spirit. So my hope is that if you feel led by the Spirit to join this group, that you will respond to that call. So this work, having already been discerned for 2025, I am beyond excited to be able to introduce this year's Swarthmore lecturer, Emily Provance. Last year, when Emily's name was revealed to me, I admit to being both delighted and unsurprised. Because being new to Friends at the time, my experience was somewhat limited, but I absolutely already knew of Emily's ministry. It was one of my earliest discoveries, and one which resonated with me powerfully across the thousands of miles between us. A ministry that is led entirely by the Spirit, even when circumstances seem to confound the possibility. A ministry that sees the impossible as an opportunity to witness the divine at work, and for which faith is the cornerstone of daily life. Emily is a full-time travelling friend, working around the world across the spectrum of theological diversity. The lecture committee were moved by her ability to harness the power of storytelling and to weave together diverse testimonies and traditions from global friends, to explore ministry and witness, whether as individual, local meeting or global community. As I became absorbed within Emily's online blog, which I very much encourage you to visit, I found Emily's Travelling Minute. I'd never heard of one of these before, but I was captivated by the idea of it. I'm sure many of you have had your own travelling minute, but for anyone that's unaware, as I was, it's a message written by the local meeting in support of friends in travelling ministry to accompany them to distant places. It serves as introduction and assurance, effectively saying, we know you don't know this person, but we do. We have sat in discernment with them. We believe they are being faithful to a valuable Spirit-led ministry, and we ask you to care for them as you receive it. When I met with Emily recently, I shared how the idea of the travelling minute had impacted me, and she shared how important this was to her too. I went back to the team at Woodbrook, and my colleagues also shared their experiences of their own travelling minutes and the meaning derived from carrying the support of their home community as they embarked on journeys to minister with friends they had not yet met. And so I can think of no better introduction than to share with you Emily's travel minute from 15th Street monthly meeting and New York yearly meeting. Dear friends, we, 15th Street monthly meeting, have united with Emily Provence's discernment that she is called by God to travel and share her gifts in ministry. Emily's life has been dedicated to carrying this out faithfully since 2013. As Emily travels globally among friends, she explores how diverse communities embody the Quaker spirit. Emily builds connections and understanding among friends through her speaking, writing, digital and social media platforms, and face-to-face visitation. She encourages people to see and know each other while embracing differences. She accompanies them as they discern their spiritual gifts. She sees herself as a teacher and a learner, and she invites us to kindle the spark at the heart of our meetings. Emily carries the love of 15th Street monthly meeting with her as she seeks to enrich our society with her gifts. We hope that you will welcome Emily in your meeting and support her in her work while she is with you and as she travels among friends. It is my privilege to uphold the request of our friends at 15th Street and of New York yearly meeting, and welcome to Friends House in London, the 2025 Swarthmore Lecturer, Emily Provance.
It really is a joy every time I get to hear that travel minute, because it is true that it's this message that your entire home community is with you wherever it is that you have gone. And everything feels a lot less lonely. 6.5 years ago, I picked up my backpack. I was in an apartment in Harlem where I had been renting a room with a couple of amazing roommates. And I picked up that backpack and I went to Chinatown and got on a bus to Ohio. And I have been traveling with that backpack ever since. This was the act of giving up having a home to go home to. At the time that I did that, I thought that it was a financial decision. I had been living in New York City for about 12 years. I loved it. And over time, I had found myself called into more and more Quaker ministry work. The trouble was that this meant I was gradually giving up my paid work in education. And since the Quaker ministry work mostly didn't pay, the math was not working well. And so one fall Sunday, I went to meeting for worship at my home meeting, 15th Street, and I remember sitting down on the bench and carrying a question into worship. It was not a question, it was more of a demand, and saying, God, one of two things is going to happen. Either you are going to have to come up with more money, or I'm going to have to give up the ministry. And it was during meeting for worship at 15th Street that it became clear that there was a third option available. I could just give up having a place to live. And suddenly, not paying rent, the math worked a lot better. The kind of life that I live now, going from place to place and being with different groups of people, did not come naturally to me. And in fact, when I was a child, I was the kind of shy that meant that I would cry if I was required to order my own food at a restaurant. When I went to my first Quaker meeting for worship, which was in 2009, I went to 15th Street, even though that was further from my home than another meeting, because the other meeting's website said something like, we usually meet on the 8th floor, but sometimes it's the 12th floor, and you need to ask the security guard on your way in. And I knew that I would not have enough courage to ask the security guard where to go and then have enough emotional capacity left over to go to meeting. So I went to 15th Street because they'd been in the same place for over 100 years. This is not the person I am today. I remember her, but I am no longer the same. I think that what happens is God transforms us into the people that God needs us to be. And my experience is that that generally happens in the context of community. People invested in me. At 15th Street in New York yearly meeting, they invested in me time and energy and patience and love and care. I remember wondering at one point when I was in a conversation with the general secretary of my yearly meeting, I suddenly apologized to him for taking up his time. I said, I know you have other things that you ought to be doing. And he said, you don't understand. This is my favorite part of this job. But I couldn't understand why. Why would a community of people do this for one another? It didn't make sense to me. It didn't feel real. And as I have gotten to know more about Friends, I've understood that what that is about is a deep understanding of our mutual dependence and knowing that every person in the community is incredibly precious. And so we do invest because we know the value of people. When I gave up my home in 2019, I thought I was making an individual decision, but it wasn't. It was all about community. My community helped me make the choice. I took it to my support committee. They told me it sounded real, and so I did this wild thing. But it also completely transformed how I understand community. And that's the story that I'm mostly going to tell you tonight. I think sometimes about Jesus in the New Testament and how Jesus said to his disciples, when you go out into the world, don't take any stuff, like don't take money, don't take food, don't take an extra shirt. And when I used to read that as a kid in the Bible, I thought that just made Jesus a terrible boss. Because it seemed like really bad planning to send your people out without anything to back them up. But then I grew to understand the preciousness of the vulnerability of experiencing hospitality. I started to learn because I have many fewer things than most people. Everything I own still fits into my backpack. I started to learn how little stuff actually matters. And as I spent time with human beings, including strangers all over the world, I started to understand how much people do matter, and how incredibly beautiful people are, and how easy they are to love. I want to say something about that love part, because it actually took me a while. Because the thing is, I always know that I'm going to leave. And so for a while, it was really hard to let myself love the people that I was with because it was gonna hurt when I had to go. But over time, what I've recognized is that yes, it hurts every single time I leave, but it is always worth it to love as hard as you can for as long as you can. So these are the first few things that I learned about community. I learned that a person can be transformed when other people invest in them. And I learned that when one person thrives, we all thrive as a result. And I learned that we are responsible for one another. And acting like it teaches us things about love. When I'm traveling in different places, something weird happens sometimes. Strangers have a tendency to open up and just start talking. One time I was in Canada and I sat down under a tree at a gas station. I was waiting for a bus. You're gonna hear a lot of stories from me tonight about waiting for a bus. I was waiting for a bus and I sat down under this tree and there was a young woman already sitting under the tree. And this young woman turned to me, and these are the first words that came out of her mouth. She said, "Yesterday I was in a car accident and my car flipped upside down. It has been totaled. I'm on my way to my very first job ever. I can't keep the job if I don't have a car, and I can't buy the car because I don't have a job. And also, my car was upside down and I don't understand why I'm not dead." And then you have to respond to that. I remember one time I was at a Pentecostal Bible study. And after the Bible study was over for the night, we were just sitting around talking, and there was a man who started getting really, really angry. And he was shouting at me about what the Bible says about homosexuality. And it was really interesting that this man was shouting at me about this because I wasn't actually arguing with him. He was somehow managing to have an argument all by himself, and I was just sitting there. And because I was sitting there and I was present and I was listening, eventually I realized that he wasn't arguing with me and he wasn't arguing with himself. He was arguing with his son who wasn't there. And once I realized that, I was able to say to him, "I am so sorry that you have been separated from your son this way. That must really hurt." And he said, "Yeah, it does." Last summer, I traveled around the United States talking about preventing election violence. And the reason I ended up talking about that, aside from leading of the Holy Spirit, because it was a strange thing for me to suddenly start doing. It was unlike other things I had done. But I started doing that in part because I knew that Quakers could, because Quakers have been working on preventing election violence in Kenya for many years. So I could learn from them. I traveled around the United States talking about what ordinary people could do to prevent election violence. And it's funny, at first, most people either really thought there wasn't anything to worry about, or they wanted to pretend there wasn't anything to worry about. And then there were actual assassination attempts. And suddenly there were a lot of conversations. But what I want to tell you about this experience is not actually doing those workshops, but what started to happen after the workshops were over. Because the thing is, because I was willing to talk about scary things, at the end of the workshop, people started coming up to me and telling me stories about the scariest thing that had ever happened to them, whether that had anything to do with what we'd been discussing or not. So many people are so scared. When I talk to people one-on-one or in small groups, and we get into deeply personal things, which happens sometimes. There's an interesting phenomenon. If we are talking by phone or by Zoom, I can almost count on about 5 minutes into the very personal piece. The person will say to me, "Hold on a minute, just hold on, I have to move." And they'll pick up their phone or their computer or whatever it is, and they will move to a new location, and then they'll start talking again. This almost always happens because the person is almost always afraid of saying the thing that is most deeply vulnerable in front of their family, their friends, or their coworkers. Almost everybody is self-censoring in some way because they're afraid of what their friends and loved ones will do if they know what they're really thinking. People are pretty desperate to be listened to. And the thing that's interesting to me is that when people start talking about these really deep internal doubts and fears, very often it turns out they're the same as the ones that I've heard from many other people. We feel alone in a way that we don't have to. So more things that I've learned about community. We're designed to be interdependent. And part of that interdependence is our ability to speak and to listen. And sometimes the person who needs you to listen is the person you meet at a gas station under a tree. The ability to respond to what's going on, like exactly around me, is also not a thing that has come naturally to me. I'm a planner. I like spreadsheets. I like calendars. I like to create a step-by-step and know exactly what's going to happen. And this is just not what my life is like anymore. One of the best things that has happened in understanding how to do that happened in the back of a car in Kenya. I was asking the question, what's the plan for the day? Where are we going? And I wasn't getting an answer. And I asked again, what is the plan? We're clearly driving somewhere. Where are we going? And still, I wasn't getting an answer to my question. And after I had asked this question enough times, I must have gotten annoying, because the Kenyan friend who was sitting beside me turned and she said, "Do you know what you're supposed to do in the next 5 minutes?" I said, "Yes, in the next 5 minutes, my job is to sit in the back of this car." And she said, "Then you're fine." I have told myself that so many times since that day. And here's what's interesting, is that because I have learned this thing about paying attention to what's happening directly in front of me and focusing on these exact 5 minutes, I've started being able to see communities that I think other people don't see. Most of us think about the community we have at home or the community that we have at work, but my community is always the one of the moment, and it's always transitory. So I am really aware of the community of people that are together in the grocery store when I go shopping. And I'm really aware of the community of people that is coexisting when we are riding on an airplane. We are constantly in overlapping, interdependent groups of people, all the time. When I'm riding on a bus and I see a mom with 2 young children, and the 2 young children are fussing or they're upset or they're throwing things at other passengers, when this happens, I have some responsibility to this mom and her 2 kids, because for the moment that we're on that bus, we are part of a shared community. I don't get to decide whether we are or are not part of a shared community. What I get to decide is how I'm going to behave in the context of the relationship. That's the part that's up to me. More lessons. There isn't ever a time when we are not in multiple communities. Being present with your immediate community is about being present in that moment. And communities exist, and I am part of them, whether I acknowledge them or not. Communities, I really believe, are involuntary. Every time that I go into a new community, I learn new, amazing things about humanity and the specific humans that are part of that group. And because of that, every time that I go into a new community, I learn more about how God moves among and between us. And every time that I go into a community, I learn more about God and about the love of God. One of the earliest things that my spiritual elders taught me when I became a friend was that sometimes, in fact, most of the time, you yourself do not have to produce the love for other people. You can channel God's love for other people. That has been incredibly useful. And as I have traveled and met, at this point, many thousands of people, I have yet to meet a person who is not worthy of love. That's just amazing to me. I mean, you hear somebody say that, but that is true. That doesn't mean that everybody I've met is easy or safe. I have met people who are difficult, I have met people who make me uncomfortable, and I have met people who are dangerous, and I do not intend to ever be with alone again. And none of that makes them unworthy of love. And it doesn't even make it so that I can't love them. All right, this is another story about a bus. I was in North Carolina. I was on a Greyhound bus, which in the States is kind of like the low-cost option for travel. And we pulled over to the side of the road. And sometimes when you pull over to the side of the road on a Greyhound bus, it just means that the driver needs to pee, and he gets off and he does that and he comes back, and it's fine. And other times, it's a really bad sign. And on this particular occasion, it was a really bad sign. The driver pulled over, got off the bus, came back on, and shouted, and I do mean shouted, "Everybody off the bus right now." And we grabbed our things as fast as we could, and we got off the bus, and we found out that we were leaking fuel. And then we were just on the side of a highway. And we had to stay there because Greyhound would not send us a new bus until they were sure that they couldn't fix our bus. And they didn't know if they could fix our bus until they sent us a mechanic, and the mechanic was at least 2 hours away. So we were there for a while. And at first it was fine. It was funny. We talked to each other. We took naps. And then it got hot. And there were elderly people, and there were small children, and it had been hours. And that's when the miracle happened. That's when a woman in her 30s pulled off the highway, opened the back door to her car, and started unloading cases of bottled water and bags of potato chips. And when she found out how long we had been there, she got back in her car and she drove off and bought 20 pepperoni pizzas and brought them back for us. So many people had driven past us that day. I asked this woman, "Why did you do this for a group of strangers?" And here's what she said. She said, "I think a lot of people don't get enough love. And when you don't get enough love, you end up with fear, and fear turns to hate. So every time I have the chance, I put a little bit of love into the world. Her name was Lindy. Fear is what happens in the absence of love. That's my experience too. I actually do meet people who tell me that they perceive me as fearless, which is absolutely not true. But for me, at least, the way that fear tends to function is that it's a lot like the concept of moss growing on a stone. If it keeps moving, it doesn't build up. So my experience has been that I have way less fear if I'm just constantly moving toward love. If that's what I'm always doing, I have a lot less fear. So I look for people that I don't understand, and I try to meet them and I try to know them. And one of the things that I've kind of stumbled into is learning that if you really want to get to know somebody, if you really want to make a heart connection, you do not invite that person to the place where you are. What you do is you go into their comfort zone in the place where they are. I learned this by accident because I can't invite anybody to anything. I don't have a place. I have a backpack. So the only thing I can do is go. And I have learned that if I am able to visit another church's Bible study, a local sporting event, a coffee shop, a street fair, and meet people in the place where they are, that's how you get to know them and make the heart connection and see the extraordinary beauty. One of my all-time favorite experiences of this happened last fall. I went to a synagogue in Michigan. I did that because there had been some pretty significant anti-Semitic threats in the area, and I wanted them to know that they had support from people outside their community. And it was interesting because, first of all, while I was in the synagogue, they invited me to read the prayer for peace. That was pretty cool. And the other thing that was interesting was that they were praying for peace in Gaza. I also spoke to the protester who was outside the synagogue. I don't always do that, but it felt like the right thing to do on that particular occasion. So I walked up to him. He had some pretty scary signs. And I asked him what it was that he hoped would happen as a result of being present there that day. What he hoped would happen was not rational. Nothing he could have done that day was going to cause what he was actually hoping would happen. But the piece of the story that I heard that I thought was really striking was that he was standing in front of that synagogue in part because it used to be his synagogue. He had worshipped there many years ago, and something happened, and he was very deeply hurt. And somehow that never got healed. And now he stands outside that synagogue every single Saturday. The next day, I had been invited with the folks that I met at the synagogue to help them clean lily pads out of a lake at a camp. That was the invitation. I said yes, why not? And so I spent a day on a kneeboard clearing lily pads out of a lake surrounded by scuba divers from the synagogue. And it was amazing because we were talking about things like multiculturalism and what it's like to convert from one faith tradition to another. And then we got deeply into questions like, can you be badly hurt and angry with a system and still love the people who are within it? I think you can. Some more lessons. A lack of love leads to fear. Fear turns to hate, and the way that we get to know somebody is by going to them. I told you that I think we are all in infinite communities, and that communities are involuntary. What I mean by infinite communities is that there are different kinds. We have geographic communities. We have the community that is our neighborhood, the community that is our town, the community that is our country, the community that is all of humanity in the world. Some of our communities are faith-based. You have a local meeting, you have an area meeting, you have a yearly meeting, and you have organizations like Friends World Committee for consultation. Some of our communities are actually communities through time. They include our ancestors and those who will come after us. We have communities everywhere, and every community, I think, involuntary. And in every one of these communities that we are part of, we can know that a person can experience transformation if we invest in them. And we can know that if one person thrives, that helps us all. And we can know that we are interdependent and we need speaking and listening. That each of our communities is better if we're aware of it and present. And that each of our communities requires love to drive out fear. Since the very beginning of Quakerism, we have been centered in the concept of community. When people ask me what is a Quaker, I tell them that there are two things we know that are kind of at the heart of our theology. One of the things that we absolutely know is that every person has a direct connection to the divine. We know that every person can hear from God. That is something that is at our heart. The other thing that we absolutely know is that we do it imperfectly. We know that we have egos and we have cultures and we have preconceptions, and our ability to hear directly from Spirit is filtered by all of those things. So we need the community. Because when we sit in discernment together, we have a better chance of being able to hear what it is that the Holy Spirit is actually telling us. So I had this crazy thought at some point that maybe if that's true, what I've just said, if it's true that God is guiding communities, and if it's true that when we listen together, we can hear that sense of the meeting, that collective leading, if that's true, I started wondering if I can cheat. By which I mean, can I do that when I'm not with Quakers? Isn't it the case that if God guides my local meeting, and if God guides my yearly meeting, and if God can guide my support committee or a clearness committee or a group of Quaker trustees, why would God then not guide other kinds of communities? Wouldn't it be the case that we could always be listening for that sense of the meeting? It feels like God surely cares as much about every other community. So I would think that God would also speak to every type of community. Once I was assuming that God was actively present and speaking, whether we were listening or not, I started seeing, is it actually possible to act like I'm in corporate discernment like 24 hours a day? Can I be listening for sense of the meeting with the group of people on the airplane, or with the group of people living in a particular neighborhood, or at the Pentecostal Bible study? Does this work if the people around me don't even know what I'm doing? And I think the answer is yes. I'll give you a couple of examples. So here's one. I was this actually is a Quaker experience, and the second story isn't. I was in a group of people who were trying to discern what they could write in terms of a minute on Palestine and Israel. And this group of people was having a really difficult time figuring out what they could put into this minute. It was made especially difficult because within this group of people were Palestinians, and within this group of people were friends who were Jewish. And they were all really scared. Eventually, it became clear that the actual sense of that meeting was everybody deserves a place to live where they don't have to be scared. That isn't something you can fix by writing a minute. But once we were clear that that was actually the sense of the meeting, we did in fact write a minute, but then we moved forward on how to address the concern everybody deserves a place to live where they don't have to be scared. That's not even a statement that's specific to the Holy Land. That is a much broader concern. The second situation was an ecumenical group that was talking about sexuality. And we went round and round, and the situation seemed completely intractable, as I'm sure you can imagine. But there came a certain point when it became clear that there was, in fact, a sense of the meeting. It just wasn't about the specific thing we were trying to figure out. The actual sense of the meeting was, everybody here loves their children. Everybody here is afraid of losing their children. Nobody here wants anyone else to lose their children. Naming that did not get us to a place of being able to move forward with the concern we said we were going to work on. But it did take us from a place of intractable conflict to mutual care and the ability to listen. When we're looking for sense of the meeting in the wild, so to speak, as opposed to sitting in a meeting for worship with a concern for business, there isn't actually an agenda. And that does make it harder because a lot of times there's no agreement on the question that we might be asking as a group. There isn't always mutual listening. Have you noticed that? That people in the world don't always listen to each other especially well. It is also the case that when you are in a group of people trying to listen for that sense of the meeting, that underlying spiritual unity, that concept that God is speaking and we can be led, it is very likely that some of the people in the room or some of the people in the wider national community are lying. And it is very likely that some people are trying to manipulate. And it is very likely that some people are deeply misinformed. But in my experience, that actually doesn't mean that they're not telling us something we need to hear. Because people don't only speak with the words that come out of their mouth. So sometimes, if I am with someone who is saying something that I know is demonstrably not true, or if I think that somebody is trying to manipulate the situation, the question that I will try to ask myself internally is, why is this person feeling the need to tell this lie? What is it that is causing this person to act in a way that they're trying to get control of what's happening here? That is a message that I actually do need to hear if I believe it is possible for us eventually to find that core kernel of common understanding. The Bible calls it homothumadon. It's something that's in the book of Acts chapter 15. It's a spiritual oneness. It's a unity of purpose. I'm going to give you the definition, which comes from Strong's Concordance, because I just find it really useful. It says, homothumadon describes a group of people acting with a unified purpose or in complete harmony. It conveys the idea of being of one mind or spirit, often in the context of prayer or worship or decision-making. The unity is not merely external agreement. It's a deep internal harmony of purpose or intent. The early Christian community saw this as a powerful testimony to the transformative work of the Holy Spirit among believers. Unified purpose or complete harmony. Would you believe that one of the best examples of this I ever saw was at a hockey game in Canada? It was amazing. We were sitting there yelling and shouting. Oh, I was so excited. I had never been to a hockey game before. And we were sitting there cheering, and every 10 minutes or so, the announcer would come on and ask a question. The announcer would say, as a reminder, we are considering how we can make this stadium a welcoming and pleasant environment for all. This is not what I was expecting to hear at a hockey game, first of all. And secondly, what amazed me was that every time the announcer said this, the people around me actually stopped to consider how we could make the stadium a welcoming place for all. It was a moment of spiritual unity at a hockey game. So when I picked up my backpack and I left my apartment and I went on the road, not knowing what was going to happen next, I told you that I thought that it was a financial decision. I also thought it was an individual decision. It was neither of those things. It was entirely about learning to see community in a totally different way. It was about learning that community is involuntary. It was about learning that we love and we love hard as long as we can. And it was about learning that no matter where I am, I can be listening for that sense of the meeting. But the next thing I want to tell you is the part that has actually been the hardest. Because this is the part that hurts a lot. Before I started traveling and I met all of the people that I've met and I learned to fall in love with all of these different people, if a war broke out in the world, that was something that was happening on the news. And now, when a war breaks out in the world, I already know people on both sides. Now, when I look at my own country and I see the extraordinary divisions that are happening around politics and culture and the rural-urban divide, I know people on both sides. I know people who are terrified of each other. And I have to ask myself, how can anybody be afraid of my friend Jason, who is a farmer? And he has a cat, and he lives in a building that was built by his grandfather. And I ask myself, how can anybody be afraid of my friend Kelsey? She is a doctor. She loves to travel. She has ceramic snowmen lined up on her windowsill. But Kelsey and Jason are scared of each other. They've actually never met, but they are both afraid of a category of people that includes the other. And neither of them would ever want to hurt anybody. But they have and they do, just like all of us do, because it's hard not to. So when I was asked to talk about community with friends tonight, I had a real, genuine question. I feel like there has to be a better way of doing this thing where we are living in community with one another, because what's happening in the world right now, that can't be it. That cannot possibly be the way that we are actually called to live together. But I also knew that I, as an individual, couldn't possibly know all of the things. And because we know as friends that we hear from the Holy Spirit imperfectly, I, as an individual, was not going to find the answers, no matter how hard I prayed, for how we were meant to live in community. I knew that I couldn't, and I knew that no small group of friends could either. But if I really believed in sense of the meeting as a concept, and if I really believed that God could lead all people, I had an idea that might get me an answer. My question was, how does God call humanity to live in community? And I thought that maybe if I looked at all Quakers in the world, because we are as different as we are, because we cross so many cultural and theological boundaries, maybe all of us together would actually have an answer to that question. How does God call humanity to live in community? So I started by collecting books of discipline. The first thing I found out is that we have no common definition of what is and isn't a book of discipline. But roughly speaking, there are about 38 different faith and practices currently in use by yearly meetings somewhere in the world. That is English language only, because I just have limits on what I'm able to do. So I sat down and I read 38 books of discipline. From the evangelicals, from the liberals, from the conservatives, from the pastorals, from the Africans, from the Europeans, from the North Americans, from the West Pacific. I read through them all. I also collected a bunch of our historical documents. And I went through the entire Bible. And I did that because our ancestors, including our very distant spiritual ancestors who wrote the Bible, are still part of our community. When we are sitting down to do sense of the meeting, when we're sitting down to discern the answers to questions, tradition is the contribution of the dead. So I wanted to know ours. And I went through these historical documents and the Bible and the 38 books of discipline with that question: how does God call humanity to live in community? And as I did it, I tried to imagine that I was clerking the world's biggest business meeting, and that every sentence in every text was something that some friend stood up and said in response to my question. Some of them were really off topic. As I was listening for that sense of the meeting, it wasn't about finding absolute agreement among all of those texts, because that's not what sense of the meeting is. It was about that homothumadon. It was about finding the underlying spiritual resonance, the places where all of that connected beneath. For example, Evangelical Friends Southwest has the only detailed passage on abuse that I found anywhere in the world. Nobody else had a lot to say about it, but when I read the text from Evangelical Friends Southwest, what they had to say about abuse was exactly what I think everybody else would say if we took the time to articulate it. And so that went into my notes as a potential part of the responses to this question. When I read the Faith and Practice that belongs to East African friends, they made a statement that I didn't find anywhere else. They said, oppression is the result of communal sin. I never would have thought to say that in that way, and nobody else in any book of discipline around the world said that in that way. But you know what? We act like we believe it. When we talk about oppression and when we write in our books of discipline about oppression, we write as though it is the result of communal sin. We just don't name it that way. So that felt to me as though it was a part of the sense of the meeting. Almost half of the documents that I read said in them somewhere that we should pay particular attention to the spiritual welfare of sailors. I have no idea. But it was clearly part of our sense of the meeting. You know, the other thing that made me laugh at first, but later it made sense, is that in nearly all of our books of discipline, we have taken the time to record that when we are asking people to write things down, we should make sure they have a pen. And yet, doesn't that make sense? Isn't part of living in community making sure that people have the tools to fulfill expectations? And so that too is part of our sense of the meeting. When I got done writing down notes of every point that I thought we might have sense of the meeting on from all of these documents, I had 161 typewritten pages of notes. That is just the stuff where I think we agree. I was amazed. And also 161 pages of notes is of no use to anybody. So I started going through it. I started sorting it. I started sorting it by topic. I started putting ideas together. I started blending sentences to create more complete concepts. And in the end, as I went through these, they distilled into 92 minutes. The shortest of the minutes are a sentence long, and the longest of them is 3.5 pages. And these 92 minutes are on widely varying topics, but all of them are part of how is humanity called to live in community. Now, those were draft minutes, and I couldn't stop there, because that's not what a clerk does. You don't write the draft minutes and call the meeting over and send everybody to eat cake. You actually have to ask for friends to respond to the minutes. I couldn't do that. I could not actually gather all friends in the world, plus all of us who have ever died, into a room. And so I went to North Carolina. And the reason I went to North Carolina is because they are the geographic location in the world with the broadest theological diversity among friends. So that seemed to be the place to test the minutes. And I asked friends to sit with me for a day, and in pairs, they read these minutes. And I said, what I need you to do is please don't wordsmith them, but just tell me, does this feel true? And if it does, then we approve it. And if it doesn't, then we take things out. That group of friends that helped me with approving the minutes did not add anything because they had not read the texts. But we took some things out if they said we collectively cannot affirm this as true. The 92 minutes that we ended up with are theologically very messy. And that's because I didn't try to fix the theology. Our books of discipline and our historical documents are written in everything from Christian to secular to universalist to who knows what kind of language. And so all of that is more or less preserved in the 92 minutes. There are points in these 92 minutes that each of you as an individual is not going to like. And there are points in the 92 minutes that I don't like. I tried really, really hard as I went through this process to record the things that I heard and not the things that I wish I heard. You're going to have a chance to see and read them all if you want to. They will have dropped on Woodbrook's website by the time I finish speaking tonight. Aled is good. He's the tech guy. If there are points within them that make any of us feel unsettled or uncomfortable, it is absolutely possible that the minutes are wrong. I just want to affirm that up front. I'm not perfect. It's also possible that the minutes are not quite where they might be someday, because that's what sense of the meeting is. We believe in continuing revelation, so sense of the meeting is the best representation of where we are right now. But also, I'd like to encourage both me and you. I go back to the minutes over and over, and I have since they were drafted. To consider the possibility that if there is something in the minutes that makes me uncomfortable, it is because I need to be made uncomfortable. We Friends say that we believe that we need one another in community because the whole is more capable of hearing than any of us as individuals. And that's what I hope these minutes have done. The group of friends on that Woodbrook committee, the Swarthmore committee you were hearing about, kept asking me which of the 92 minutes might I focus on when I spoke with you tonight. I could not pick. And I couldn't pick because really, genuinely, I don't think there are like the ones that are important and then the ones that are not. That just isn't how it unfolded. So here's what I did do. I don't have complete minutes in this bowl, but I have quotes. And I'm just going to draw a few, and I legitimately don't know which ones they're going to be, so that you can hear some of what came up in responses to that question: how does God call humanity to live in community? This one comes from minute number 73, which I've called Peace and Justice and Economics. Living in luxury blunts empathy. Living very simply allows us to focus more on helping others. Take scrupulous care of the possessions you have so that they will last. Never consume excess and thus make others work harder than they need to. This is number 15, and it comes from one called How the Adversary Divides Us. Adversary, in this context, a reference to the old way that Quakers used it, meaning that force which is against God. Work in diverse groups on common practical goals that you can't achieve alone. Working on a common project increases union between groups. But sometimes spending time in fellowship is more important than getting the work done. It's funny, these came from our books of discipline, but some of them line up awfully well with sociological research. There's a book that I love called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, and it talks about the ways in which cultures are invisibly different. I come from the United States. My people like to work together to get to know each other. That is how we unify. We work side by side. When I go to Kenya, I can't figure out how they ever get anything done. But here's the thing, they do. They do. Which tells me that it's not that my way is the right way or the effective way. It tells me that there are different ways. And there are days when I wake up in the morning and I decide, today I'm going to try to be Kenyan. And I am going to prioritize the relationships with the people right in front of me. And that's how I'm going to go through my day. This one comes from minute 62, which is emotions. Honor your difficult emotions and transform them through action so that you don't end up seeding war. How we respond to provocation is part of how we demonstrate Christ's way. I'll give you just a couple more. Okay, this one is minute 61. It comes from one called Emergencies and Crises. It is our nature to separate from each other when we are afraid. Mutual support helps us through trauma. When we face a common danger, we come out the other side better friends. I see this all the time in my travels. I told you about how many people are scared. It is our nature to separate from each other when we are afraid. I see it every day. People who have something genuinely scary in their life, but they react to it by going into a cave and closing everybody else out. And actually, many of our problems are not that human. And what actually helps is to reach out to one another. All right, last one for the night. Just trust me, that wasn't the right one to end on. All right, this one is minute 37, which is on ending relationships. It was really striking to me as I was doing all of this work of reading and listening and paying attention and trying to find sense of the meeting, that we have written as much as we have about ending relationships. And I think it is because we have to recognize that it's real, that it's part of the lives that we lead. Sometimes we try everything, and we end the relationship because it is necessary, and it has nothing to do with lacking love. This one is about one of the steps that happens before we get that far. So this quote says, "When someone else's words make you uncomfortable, think carefully before confronting them. When there is tension in the room, pause to remember the belovedness of those you are with." I think I use that every single day. When there is tension in the room, pause to remember the belovedness of the people you are with. Thanks, friends.